Danny Ruiz had been running commercial nets on the Illinois River for 21 years. On a Tuesday morning in March, he pulled his heavy mesh at first light and stood motionless in his aluminum boat. Not because the nets were empty, but because the invader that had choked every single haul for the last 11 years was completely gone. The Asian carp, an ecological plague that engineers spent $200 million trying to electrify out of existence. Today, we are going to look at the exact biological data behind a localized collapse that is defying every mathematical model on record. By the end of this file, you will understand how one of the most catastrophic invasions in North American history is being systematically dismantled from the bottom up. But the mechanism erasing these fish is not a sudden aquatic disease. It is not a secret government culling program, and it is not a breakthrough in trapping technology. It is a phantom force that humanity spent the last century trying to destroy. To understand the sheer impossibility of what is happening in this 12-mile stretch of the Illinois River, you have to look at the brutal mathematics of the invasion. For 3 decades, wildlife biologists and the Army Corps of Engineers have operated under a single, terrifying consensus: humanity was losing the war. A single mature female Asian carp produces up to 1 million eggs per spawning season. They do not just share a river, they weaponize their reproduction to compress native species into the margins, permanently monopolizing up to 90% of the total biological mass in the waterways they occupy. The official government response was desperate and mechanical. Massive concrete and steel infrastructure was poured into military-grade electric barriers across the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, a last-ditch effort to protect the $7 billion Great Lakes fisheries. Commercial harvesting initiatives were heavily subsidized to pull millions of pounds of meat from the water. Yet statistical reality proved these efforts entirely futile. Wildlife managers calculated a brutal biological baseline. To simply stabilize the population and stop it from growing, they needed to cull 50 to 70% of the invasive mass annually. It was a threshold human engineering never came close to touching. Every metric, every budget, and every predictive model pointed to a total, permanent defeat. But in 2024, a completely different set of numbers crossed the desk of lead researchers, and what they found in the shallows was not what anyone expected. The Asian carp did not arrive as an invasion, they arrived as a solution. In 1972, aquaculture farms across the American South deliberately introduced bighead and silver carp to clean algae from wastewater treatment ponds, a controlled, sensible tool for a specific industrial problem. Then the Mississippi River flooded. Within a single decade, these biological calculators had rewritten the arithmetic of every waterway they entered. The numbers are not metaphor, they are mechanism. A single mature female bighead carp does not reproduce, she detonates. Between 500,000 and 1 million eggs per spawning season, released into open water with no evolutionary predator waiting at the other end. Native species like the paddlefish and buffalo fish, which produce thousands of eggs under ideal conditions, were not competing with Asian carp. They were being arithmetically erased by them. By 1990, federal biologists monitoring the Illinois River recorded something that had no precedent in North American freshwater ecology. The invasive biomass was not growing alongside native populations. It was replacing them entirely, compressing every native species into the remaining 10% of available biological space. The water that had once run clear enough to support dense submergent vegetation was now a permanent, churning murk, a turbidity so severe that native aquatic plants could no longer photosynthesize at depth. The river had not been invaded, it had been converted. The devastating simplicity of the mechanism is this: you cannot outbreed a species that produces 1 million offspring per female per season. Every native fish, every aquatic plant, every invertebrate at the base of the food chain was being slowly suffocated under the weight of pure reproductive mathematics. And the moment we realized what was happening, the desperate human war began. The war began the way American problems always begin, with concrete, electricity, and an enormous budget. In 2002, the Army Corps of Engineers activated the first electric barrier system on the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, a permanent charge running through the water column designed to create an impassable wall of voltage between the Mississippi River Basin and Lake Michigan. By the time the second and third barrier units came online, the total infrastructure investment had crossed $200 million. Simultaneously, state and federal agencies launched aggressive commercial harvesting programs, subsidizing processing plants and export contracts to pull Asian carp from the water by the millions of pounds. The results were not encouraging, they were mathematically catastrophic. In 2012, a joint assessment by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Army Corps of Engineers ran the population dynamics and arrived at a number that effectively indicted every program then in operation. To hold the invasive population flat, not reduce it, not reverse it, simply prevent further growth, wildlife managers needed to remove between 50 and 70% of the total carp mass from affected waterways every single year. Commercial harvesting programs, at their absolute peak output, were achieving removal rates in the low single digits. The electric barriers were not removing fish at all, they were theoretically slowing the front line of the advance. The devastating simplicity of the math is this: humans were winning individual battles, hauling nets, running voltage, holding press conferences, while losing the biological war by 60 percentage points every single season. By 2020, the population in the Illinois River had not stabilized, it had not reversed. Every predictive model published by federal ecologists described the same long-term outcome: total, permanent biological replacement. Every human metric pointed to total, permanent defeat, until an entirely different set of numbers crossed Dr. Alicia Strand's desk. Dr. Alicia Strand was not looking for a miracle, she was looking for an error. A freshwater ecologist with 9 years of continuous fish population monitoring along the Illinois River, Strand had built her career on one governing assumption shared by every federal agency, every wildlife manager, and every predictive model in the field. The carp numbers only moved in one direction. So when her 2021 dataset showed a biomass reduction in a specific 12-mile monitoring corridor, she did what any rigorous scientist would do: she assumed the instruments were wrong. She ran the electrofishing surveys again. She cross-referenced against independent trawl sampling data. She pulled the acoustic telemetry logs that had been running continuously through the corridor since 2015. 3 separate methodologies, 3 separate data streams, one conclusion that should have been statistically impossible. The carp biomass in that corridor had not spiked. It had not plateaued. It had tracked steadily, measurably downward across 3 consecutive seasons, 2019, 2020, and 2021, at a rate that no human removal program operating anywhere on the Illinois River had ever come close to achieving. The devastating simplicity of what she was looking at is this: the data described a biological force working inside the water column, continuously, around the clock, in a corridor where no new government program had been launched and no new technology had been deployed. Something was hunting. Field report: are you seeing sudden shifts in your local wildlife populations? Drop your city and state in the comments and tell us what's changing in your area. Now back to the data, because what comes next is even more disturbing. Strand drove to the river with her field kit and a single working hypothesis: illegal, large-scale poaching, dense, organized, and operating below the regulatory radar for 3 full years. She went to the river expecting to find illegal poachers, but what she found instead was a ghost. The ghost had left tracks. Pressed deep into the soft alluvial mud at the water's edge, the impressions were enormous, the unmistakable drag marks and lateral body prints of an animal that dwarfs every other freshwater predator in North American river systems. Dr. Strand crouched at the bank and measured 10 feet, 300 pounds. A cranial profile like a crocodile, a body plated in interlocking gannate scales so dense and geometrically precise they were used as arrowheads by indigenous peoples for thousands of years before European settlement. The alligator gar, Atractosteus spatula, a species so ancient that its fossil record predates the formation of the Rocky Mountains by 60 million years, carrying a design so effective that 100 million years of evolution had found no reason to alter it. It had been functionally eradicated from the Illinois River by the mid-20th century, not by habitat loss alone, but by deliberate human removal campaigns. State electrofishing programs in the 1950s and 1960s systematically targeted alligator gar as a trash fish, a perceived threat to sport fish populations. By 1970, verified sightings in the Illinois River had dropped to near zero. A predator that had regulated this waterway for longer than the river itself had existed, in its current form, was simply gone. And now it was back, patrolling the shallows, moving through the exact 12-mile corridor where 3 seasons of impossible data had accumulated. The devastating simplicity of the moment is this. Strand had gone looking for human criminals and found instead a prehistoric apex predator quietly doing the one job nature had spent 100 million years training it to do. But a few scattered predators don't collapse an invasion unless you look at the hidden biological mathematics of exactly how they hunt. The gar did not return by accident, someone put them there. Back at her desk, Dr. Strand pulled the Illinois Department of Natural Resources stocking archives and found a program so modestly funded and so quietly administered that it had generated almost no federal attention in 15 years of continuous operation. In 2008, a joint Missouri and Illinois wildlife initiative began releasing hatchery-raised juvenile alligator gar into select river corridors, not as an invasive species management tool, not as a carp suppression program, but as a routine biodiversity restoration effort. The paperwork described it as ecological bookkeeping. Nobody in the Asian Carp Task Force had ever cross-referenced it against biomass data. Strand laid the 2 datasets side by side. The stocking timeline, the carp decline curve, they did not loosely correlate, they locked together with the precision of a key entering a lock. Here is the biological mechanism that $200 million of human engineering could not replicate. Alligator gar do not hunt adult carp. They hunt the shallows, targeting first and second-year juveniles in the exact developmental window when carp are most numerically dense and most physically vulnerable. A single adult gar, feeding continuously, does not need to kill millions of fish. It only needs to push the annual juvenile survival rate below the mathematical replacement threshold, the same 50 to 70% removal benchmark that human programs could never touch, and hold it there, season after season, year after year, without budget cycles, equipment failures, or congressional appropriations. The devastating simplicity of the mechanism is this. The gar did not fight the invasion. It starved it at the source, 1 juvenile carp at a time, for 15 uninterrupted years. Field report. Have you noticed any native predators returning to your local ecosystems? Comment with your geographic location and the species you're seeing. Now back to the data, because what comes next is even more disturbing. This wasn't just a victory, it was a devastating indictment of how the invasion started in the first place. The Asian carp did not conquer an intact ecosystem, they colonized a vacancy. This is the realization that reframes everything. The invasion did not succeed because Asian carp are an unstoppable biological force. They are prolific, yes. They are aggressive filter feeders, yes. But in a fully functioning river system, one with its complete evolutionary architecture still in place, their juvenile survival rate would have collided with exactly the kind of apex predation pressure Dr. Strand just documented. The carp's reproductive mathematics only became a death sentence for native species because the biological check on those mathematics had already been removed. The timeline is precise and damning. State electrofishing programs eradicated alligator gar from the Illinois River through the 1950s and 1960s. The Asian carp escaped containment ponds and entered the Mississippi Basin in the early 1970s. The vacancy and the invasion did not merely overlap. One created the conditions for the other. The devastating simplicity of this realization is this: we did not lose a war against an invasive species. We lost it against ourselves. We cleared the apex predator, left the door open, and then spent $200 million trying to build a mechanical substitute for the biological lock we had already destroyed. The 12-mile corridor on the Illinois River is not a triumph of wildlife management. It is a proof of concept, a single, localized demonstration of what happens when a river is allowed to remember what it used to know. Now this localized miracle races against a ticking clock on a much larger map. The 12-mile corridor is not the finish line, it is the warning shot. 40 million people draw their drinking water from the Great Lakes Basin. The connected system of Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario represents the single largest repository of surface freshwater on the planet, anchoring a $7 billion annual fishing industry that has supported commercial and recreational harvests for over a century. And the only thing standing between that system and the advancing carp front is a series of electric barrier units installed on the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal beginning in 2002, infrastructure that is now more than 2 decades old, that requires permanent power to operate, that has already recorded multiple confirmed breach events during high-water flood conditions, and that no engineer has ever described as a permanent solution. The Army Corps of Engineers has stated publicly that the barriers are a bridge measure. They were never designed to hold indefinitely. The devastating simplicity of the geography is this: the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal is the only man-made connection between the Mississippi River Basin and Lake Michigan. It is 96 miles long. The barriers occupy a fraction of that distance. When not if the infrastructure degrades below operational threshold, the carp will not pause, they will move. What the Illinois River Corridor has now demonstrated is that a sufficiently established alligator gar population can suppress juvenile carp below replacement levels. But alligator gar mature slowly, establish territories gradually, and require years of continuous stocking before a population reaches functional predation density. The clock on the barriers and the clock on the gar restoration are not running at the same speed. Which leaves us with the only question that matters for the next decade of American freshwater survival. What Dr. Strand found in a 12-mile stretch of the Illinois River was not a local anomaly, it was a mirror. If a 100-million-year-old predator, quietly restored by a modestly funded biodiversity program that nobody in the Carp task force had ever read, can silently dismantle an invasion that $200 million of human engineering could not slow, then everything we thought we knew about ecological collapse is wrong. The crisis was never the carp. The crisis was the vacancy we created before the carp ever arrived. The gar were gone, the carp walked in, the barriers went up, the gar came back, the carp are vanishing, one prehistoric predator, 15 years, no budget meetings, no press releases. Nature does not need our permission to heal, it only needs us to stop actively preventing it. We spent decades thinking the Asian carp invasion was a story about an unstoppable species. We were wrong. It was always a story about a missing one. But the Illinois River isn't the only place where nature is quietly rewriting the outcome. In New York City, something has already started hunting the rats, and the city has no idea what it is yet. Click the video on your screen right now to see what is already moving through the tunnels. Subscribe to Prime Discoveries to join the research collective, and we will see you in the next file. The river was never dying, it was waiting.